So I think in the outside world, outside this ghetto, prejudice in general, not only against Catholics, but against Jews, has the old forces on the run.
Mm-hmm. When I think in your book you talk about the Calvinism of the 17th century, and it seems so strong, the Puritan psyche, the Puritan conscience, the Puritan intellect. Why do you think the Great Awakening cooled as fast as it has arisen? Because this was the precursor, when you, as you say, when the Declaration of Independence was written and our founders were active, hardly, a very small number went to church.
That's right. Well, Calvinism itself, before the Great Awakening, was splintering. They had decided that they couldn't keep up the early situation in which every individual had to be saved alone. No one could save you or help you. Your parents couldn't. You couldn't belong to a church just because your parents did. Well, that was very hard to maintain after the first fervor of the founders, the settlers. And so they came up with the halfway covenant, in which, you could go to communion, you wouldn't, even though you had not been saved. And then, of course, there was a great reaction against that. The conservatives and the liberals were falling apart. Well, the Great Awakening offered Jonathan Edwards and others a great hope that you didn't have to be saved all alone. You could go to a revival, and you would all be saved together. And so Jonathan Edwards, who had opposed the liberalization of Calvinism, used this as a way of saying, we're not liberalizing, we're just saving everybody. And but the strains of that were so obvious in terms of the old orthodoxy, and simply because Calvinist orthodoxy was so great, I think that the Great Awakening had an internal stress that made it impossible to carry on.
Yeah, with suicides even, and attempted suicides after the sermons.
Yeah.
And that, you talk about the Puritan conscience, and it seems to me that this certainly resonated with me as an immigrant, and what I love about this country and what drives me crazy about this country. At the same time, this Puritan conscience was a kind of blend of the anarchic and the authoritarian, no rules and strict rules, and that I think is a fascinating part of the American psyche still, because it lies at the root of that, as you say, that our radical individualism, which in turn, as Robert Bellah and others says, that individualism itself can go rancid, and de Tocqueville talking about individualism as not a flattering thing. Could you say something about how we made de Tocqueville's critique of our individualism and that sense of the anarchic and authoritarian made it into a virtue? We turned what was a criticism of the American way into a virtue.
Yeah, that's part of the whole heritage of Puritanism. Puritanism failed as a Calvinist orthodoxy, but its value system lived on in transcendentalism and individualism and all of these things, and especially in the idea that we are a city on a hill, the American exceptionalism, American sense that other people do not have our perfection. But the idea that the individual can be saved alone continued in a bastard form, so that what was considered individualism in Europe as a flaw, described when Tocqueville came here, was now adopted as a secular virtue, that we can't be saved alone the way the Calvinists thought, but we can save ourselves alone. We can be self-made. It's, from a Calvinist point of view, it's blasphemous that only God can make us, but now the American attitude was we can be the self-made man.
And worship our Creator.
Well, yeah, be your own. As Chesterton said, self-made men are not very careful of choosing their maker.
That's right. Then you actually ask the question, how on earth did they hold their odd world and their odder selves together? And your answer is by intense intellectual effort. There was a tremendously vigorous, coherent, if difficult, theological system that held that.
We've never had a more learned clergy than in the Puritan era. They knew their Hebrew, they knew their Greek, they knew their Latin. Many of them knew Calvin's French, many of them knew Luther's German. They wrote immense tracts. It was a very tight, closed system. And what made it so powerful is the absolute fit of all the parts. And of course, that's what had to be torn apart by the people who attacked the Trinity and the idea that you have the sacrifice of a son to a cruel God. That was the Calvinist picture.
Yeah, penal substitution taken from Anselm was considered scriptural.
Right.
And was
that
and
we
still
have,
is embedded
because man had sinned, he owed an infinite debt and he was unable to pay that because he's finite. So only an infinite Savior could come down and die for us. And God sent his son and killed him for that purpose. The reformers of the Unitarian and Universalist and Deist era decided that that was cruel and had to be broken up. So it was a very nice, tight system, but it was inhuman.
And then, after that, you dispel the myth that, as you said earlier, that our founding was very, very religious, and it's been downhill ever since. You successfully argue, to my mind, that the deism of the founders was very, very important to the beginning of our country.
Yeah, we're lucky. We're lucky that the Calvinist and, in general, evangelical wave was at a low ebb at that time. It probably would not have been possible to separate church and state if the forces opposing that had not been weak. Separation of church and state was an astonishing innovation. It had never happened before. There had never been a country founded without an official cult and an official God to bless that country. Everything else in our Constitution, federalism, bicameralism of the legislature, tripartite parts of the administration, judicial independence, they'd all been around in theory and practice. Never had anybody set out to say, this government cannot interfere with religion. We did it for the first time, and it's been a success, not only for us, but for other countries. When the Dalai Lama came to Chicago to speak at the Field Museum, he asked the director, I don't like to give lectures. I put the crowd to sleep. I like to have somebody on the stage who will challenge me, ask me questions. So I was one of those asked to be on stage with him. Before we went out, he asked us, don't be deferential to me. That makes everything so boring. Ask me hard questions. Well, it's a little hard to think of a hard question on the spot. But what I did ask him was, if you were restored to your country now, what would you do in a different way? And he said, I would disestablish the religion, because the American system is the proper one. And as we were going out, I said to him, for that, don't you need an enlightenment? And he said, there's the problem.
There's the problem.
His very next book was written to the theme, Buddhism has not faced up to the challenge of modern reason and science.
Yeah.
He wanted to get to where we started.
Yet it seems a persistent thing that modern writers, whether they're Catholic evangelicals or evangelical evangelicals, really want to make the founders appear pious. Thinking of Michael Novak's wanting to picture Washington on his deathbed, praying with his wife.
Yes.
Now we don't know whether he did or not, but it seemed very important to have that picture that our founders were of a deeply pious kind.
Yes, the evangelicals can't admire a person who's not religious. And by the religious, they mean their religion. You know, it's what they want them to be Christian. And not just Christian, but Christian.
Real Christian.
Right. When I've talked to evangelicals over the years, some of them have asked me, "Are you a Christian?" And I say, "Yes." And they say, "What sort?" And I say, "Catholic." "Oh, no, you're not a Christian." You know,
You say, "Are you a Christian?" You can say, "Well, not yet."
Right. Well, that's the proper answer. When I dedicated a book to my friend Dan Berrigan, the priest who is an anti-war activist, I dedicated it to Dan Berrigan, Christian. And he said to me, I didn't consult him before giving it to him, I thought I might please him. And he said, "You left out the all-important adjective, would be."
Would be. Hope to. But there were many people who, you know, subsequent to the Declaration of Independence, you quote of Chauncey Lee saying, "The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution has not the impress of religion upon it. It was you say it was the 18th century equivalent of secular humanism, considered a horrible manifestation of fallen humanity by many today, from women's liberation to evolution." So what amazes me is those battles, and we could, if we had hours, talk about the Scopes trial and about everything, how that whole thing persists and has an energy and a life, and it keeps coming back.
Well, there's a kind of religious imperialism. We want to claim others for our religion. My Catholic friends have tried to do that many times. John Courtney Murray tried to claim that the founders were Catholics, you know, which is something that would really have surprised them. It's interesting, with the religious right you have two strands. On the one hand, they'll say they were not real Christians, therefore deists are atheists, which is etymologically impossible. On the other hand, they'll say they were good guys, so they must have been real Christians. Right. And they seesaw back and forth, and they use evidence in a most extraordinary way to do it.
Another disconnection, because you do, I think, make a good argument about the lineage from the Puritans to the Transcendentalists, but again you get to the Civil War, there's a real sort of shocking disconnection reading about some of the Transcendentalist response, say, to John Brown's raid. Theodore Parker said it was not only the right but the duty of slaves to kill their masters. Quote, "All the great charters of humanity have been written in blood." Henry Ward Beecher saying, "Give me war redder than blood and fiercer than fire." Horace Bushnell, "Blood, blood, rivers of blood have bathed our 100 battlefields and sprinkled the horns of our altars. Blood, not logic." And I mean, that to me is another great disconnection when you think of the people who are writing that, and how the Civil War was this, not just the war between the states and the issue of slavery, but a great apocalyptic vision of a kind of cleansing of this country, which of course it didn't happen, but I find that's that so difficult.
The Civil War is the climax of our Romantic period, and that was a time of mystery and heroism and clashing in blood. And it was true on both sides, of course. The South had the same kind of glorification of their bloody cause. They called Lincoln the Antichrist, and we had the Battle Hymn of the Republic with all of the blood of the splashing up to the horses' knees, etc. Well, the thing to say about that, several things, is that in war, we tend to become more religious, if not fanatical. All wars. This war included, of course. It's in the Civil War that we put "In God We Trust" on our money. It's in the Cold War that we put "Under God" into the salute to the flag.